Hey everybody, my name's Todd and I'm going to teach you how to get better at chess. No, not checkers. At chess. Ooh, nice hand. How many countries does Canada border? Chess. I'm going to make you better at chess. Let's get started. Hello everybody, welcome to Chess 101. Today's lesson is how the chess pieces move, part 2. And we're going to talk about the pawns. Now the pawns, as you learned in the first video where I showed you how to set up the pieces, they go on the 2nd rank for white, they would go on the 7th rank for black. And the pawns are a very simple piece, but they are very complex in the way they move. So the first rule of the pawn is that any pawn can move one square, but they only move straight ahead. They can never move backwards. They can never move sideways. They don't move diagonally. Except for taking, which I'm going to show you. So if we wanted, we could move this pawn one square. We could move this pawn one square. We could move this pawn one square. We could come back and move this pawn on a square. So the pawns just slowly creep and make their way up the board, okay? That's how they work. They just move one square at a time. Now, when they're on this row, this back row, this 2nd rank where they sit when they start, they can move on their first move, the first time the pawn moves, it can move 2 squares. So you could move this pawn 2 squares if you wanted. You don't have to. You can move it 1, but you can move it 2. Now, if you move it 2 and it's here, then if you want to move it again, you can only move it 1 square. So to get the pawn all the way to the end of the board takes 5 moves. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There you go. It's at the end of the board. And we're going to talk at the very end about what happens when the pawn gets to the end of the board. Now, let's say that you move your piece 2 squares, and then you move this piece 1 square, and then later on you want to move this piece 2 squares. Well, you can't do it because once it moves, it can never move 2 squares. It's only on the initial one. So you can't like say, well, the first time I moved this is 1 square, and now I'm going to move it 2 squares. It doesn't work that way, okay? Now, how the pawns take. So let's say that the pawn is here, and let's just put a black piece on the board. Okay, the black knight, it's sitting there, it's blocking the pawn. So the pawn, we know it moves straight ahead, it moves 1 piece, 1 square straight ahead. But the pawn can't take this knight. The knight's actually blocking the pawn. It's stopping the pawn from moving forward. Most chess pieces you would just take with the pawn, right? But the pawn doesn't work that way. The pawn is a special way it takes. The pawn can only take on the diagonal, the square right here, the square right here. So if I put my knight here, that blocks this pawn. However, if I had the knight over here, for example, and I didn't move it, and your pawn was sitting there and it was your move, you would take it and you would move here. And now you would have 2 pawns on the same file because you took my knight and you had to move over diagonally. Now it's possible that if these pieces were lined up diagonally, if I put a queen and a rook, you could take the knight, take the queen, take the rook, and you would have a piece that started over here and ended up all the way over here. And it's even possible, and I've seen this in games where, you have a piece here and a piece here, and what happens is somebody makes this move, and then on their next move, they take this piece, right? So the pawn is there behind the queen, and then somebody moves here, and then they take this piece, and now they have 3 pawns just all lined up. And then this pawn is blocked by this pawn. It can't move until this pawn moves. This pawn can only move 1 square. But before either of these 2 pawns can move, this has to move. And you can never move diagonally. You can only move straight ahead. You can only take pieces diagonally. So that's how pawns work. They just move 2 squares initially, or 1, but then after they move, they can only move 1 square to the end of the board. Now, I've told you that the pawns capture diagonally. There's a special move that pawns make, and I'm going to show you an example here. So I'll start by clearing the board. Okay, so now what we have is we just have 2 pieces on the board, the 2 pawns. The white pawn is here. It's on E5, and here's the black pawn. It's on F7. Now, in this situation, remember I told you the pawn can move 1 or 2 squares? Well, what if the black pawn decided it didn't want to get taken by this pawn and it moved 2 squares? See, it just moves right through the square where white could capture it. And it's like, oh, now white can't take it. It just like passed it, right? Well, actually, it can. There's a special move called en passant. It's a French term. It means in passing. And what it means is if a pawn, and only a pawn, on its first move moves 2 squares, and there is a pawn that could have captured it diagonally if it had moved 1 square, on the very next move, the pawn could capture it as if it had moved 1 square. So this is how it would work. The black pawn gets pushed up to here. The white pawn moves diagonally here and then removes the black pawn like it wasn't on that square, okay? So, in effect, if I move the black pawn 1 square, the white pawn could take it. If I move the black pawn 2 squares, white pawn can take it. Same thing. Now, here's the caveat to that. Let's say I have another pawn on the board. Put it right here, okay? And I move this here. And you decide not to take this. You decide to push this pawn. And then I move, let's say I have a rook, and I move my rook to here. You can't then decide, oh, wait, you know what? Now I want to take this pawn in passing. Okay? And the reason you can't do that is because you only do it on the move that it moves. As soon as it moves, on your next move, you can take it. But once it's moved there, if you don't take it right away, then you can't take it later on. Okay? It's called en passant, in passing. It's a very... it's used every day in chess. Most beginning players have never seen it. I played in a tournament once where, no kidding, I made this happen. They pushed their pawn past me, thinking they could get down to the end of the board, and I took. Okay, and then he said, "What are you doing?" I said, "En passant." And we stopped the clock and called the guy over. He'd never seen it, so it's a rule you should definitely know it. It can only happen if the pawn is on this rank right here, the 5th rank going this way. And if it's the other way, then it has to be right here. So the white pawn's coming this way, the black pawn can take the pawn going this direction. Now, the very last thing about pawns. Remember I said on the last video where we talked about how many points they were worth? Well, what happens when the pawn gets to the end of the board? Because it can't take anything down here because there's nothing to take. Well, when the pawn reaches the end of the board, it can become any piece that you desire. So I can make this pawn a queen. I can make it a rook. I can make it a bishop. I can make it a knight. The only thing you can't make it is another king. You can only have 1 king, and you can't leave it as a pawn. You have to convert it to some piece. And the way you typically do it is, as soon as you push it to the end, you call out what piece you're promoting it to. So if you would push it here and say queen, and then you would grab the queen, replace the queen on the pawn, and now you have another queen. And then, of course, on your next move, the queen, you can move it however a queen moves. So to recap, we'll go through really quick. On the first move of a pawn, it can move how many squares? 1 or 2. It can move 1. It can move 2. Once it moves, whether it moves 1 or 2 squares, it only can move 1 square at a time. Okay? When it takes only diagonally, and it occupies a square. And then the in passing or en passant, if on the first move a pawn moves through the attacking square of another pawn, the other pawn can take it and take the place of the pawn. Only pawns. If another piece moved through there, you couldn't take it. Only pawns. And then finally, when the pawn gets to the end of the board, it gets promoted to any piece you desire. Most of the time, a queen. I'll show you a video later on where you wouldn't want to promote it to a queen. You would want what's called under promoting it to a different piece. So that is today's video on how the pawns move. We're going to do another video on castling. That's a special move. Thanks for watching Chess 101. Subscribe to the videos and get better at chess.